Good afternoon, honorable board members. Before we begin this discussion, I'd like to take a moment to extend a tremendous amount of thanks and gratitude to the folks who have dedicated countless hours to help us venture down this road navigating the complex nature of risk-limiting audits. First and foremost, I need to take a moment and recognize the efforts of John Marion, the Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, in his work to bring risk-limiting audits to the Ocean State. John didn't simply advocate for the law to be passed and walk away. John's work with the Board of Elections was crucial in initially connecting our staff to important risk-limiting audit experts throughout the country. From these initial contacts, we established a network of many individuals from throughout the country who we have relied on to formulate all of our understanding of risk-limiting audits and how to implement them. John was also involved with almost every weekly conference call over the past 12 months and played a huge part in most of the content in the recent Rhode Island Risk-Limiting Audit Working Group report. His personal effort is definitely a big part of where we are today. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I'd like to second that. I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Marion for all the help that he gives this board.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the other members of the working group, in particular Mark Linderman, who is sitting at the table with Steve and Miguel, who unsurprisingly traveled here today from New York for this meeting because that is just what he does. Mark has always made himself available to answer questions from our staff concerning risk-limiting audits, whether it was a late-night weekend email or a last-minute request for a conference call. Mark always found time to not only answer our questions, but also answer them thoroughly in a way that actually made sense to us. We also want to thank John McCarthy of Verified Voting, who has been indescribably critical in keeping the group focused, documented, and organized on the myriad of tasks that were necessary to piece together to get us to where we are today. Other group members who were on almost every weekly call, such as Wilfred Coddington of the Brennan Center, Lynn Garland and Luther Weeks of Connecticut Voters to Count, Tom Murphy, our software engineer, Neil McBurnett of Colorado, Ron Rivest and Mary Schreider, I'm sure I just killed that name, of MIT, and Suzanne Mello-Stark from Rhode Island College, who provided a tremendous amount of technical guidance from the outset. There were many others involved, and sometimes our calls would have well over 20 people on the line. Many just listening in because they were interested in what was brewing on risk-limiting audits in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is the second state in the country to implement risk-limiting audits statewide, and the first in the country to do it with ballots cast at the precincts. Most importantly, and not to be forgotten, I have all the respect and admiration for the staff of the Board of Elections, Miguel Nunez, our Deputy Director, and Steve Taylor, Special Projects Coordinator, who have spent hours being devoted and very dedicated to the risk-limiting audit project. They have obtained the knowledge and coordinated the efforts to bring risk-limiting audits to you today. Miguel has been involved with 25 statewide elections. Steve has been through 22 statewide elections, and I have been through 27 statewide elections. And our task is to take our knowledge on how elections in Rhode Island are administered under our laws and determine how these potential risk-limiting audits could potentially scale up for a statewide election, and find one that strikes an appropriate balance between efficiently conducting the election from beginning to end and verifying the integrity and accuracy of our modern voting system. Please welcome Miguel and Steve as they present their findings on risk-limiting audits on their behalf, the staff recommendations to you.
Thanks for all you do.
Good afternoon, honorable board members. As Bob already mentioned, I have here at the table with me Steve Taylor, the Special Projects Coordinator, Mark Linderman, the Senior Science and Technology Policy Officer for Verified Voting, who's graciously come out here and made himself available to answer any potential questions that you might have regarding the risk limiting audits. I'd like to start by mentioning that although Steve and I participated in the RLA working group discussions every week for almost the past year, our role was primarily to provide them with the information they needed about all of our facilities, resources, and procedures that we use to administer the elections. We didn't have any input in the recommendations, in their recommendation to use the ballot comparison method in the report. And the report, as you know, as you've seen in the meeting with John Maria on August 14th, is a great report. And I think it serves as a tremendous guide for us and for any other jurisdiction that is looking to implement risk-limiting audits to refer to in terms of how each of the three types of audits that we conducted in the pilot could be conducted and what the cost and time involved with each one would be. So it's a tremendous report, and I won't spend much time highlighting the outcome of our pilot because I know that John had spoken about that in the August 14th meeting. I know that the pilot was extremely important for us in our decision-making process. And that ultimately led us to make the recommendations that we're making today, what we learned in that pilot. The pilot gave us first-hand knowledge of the amount of effort that each of these different RLAs involved. Because remember, for the pilot, we did run all three of these types of RLAs. Just to gauge how each one would work. Of course, a pilot can only demonstrate a workload on a small scale, and we only dealt with 8,000 to 9,000 ballots in that pilot. And what I'm going to show you in my presentation here today is I have some data that I'm going to show on the screen here in a little bit. But first, I'm going to go over the different types of pilots in a second. Now, as you know, in addition to our weekly meetings with the working group, we also sent staff to Arapahoe, Colorado, and Denver, Colorado, and Kalamazoo, Michigan, which Steve was gracious enough to go to in the middle of December. So he took one for the team, that one. It's not definitely warm in Michigan. And over the past 2 years, we've had countless discussions about RLAs with RLA experts, election officials, and just in the last 2 weeks in preparing for this presentation, we spoke more extensively with Jennifer Morrell from the Democracy Fund, and she's the former director of the Arapahoe County Division of Elections out in Colorado. We spoke to Jerome Lovato, who is the director of testing and certification for the Federal Election Assistance Commission. We spoke with Monica Childers from she's a product manager over at Voting Works, an organization that's doing a lot of work in relation to RLAs. And we also spoke to Virginia Vanderoos. She's with the Michigan Secretary of State's office, who Michigan, although they don't have an RLA law, are doing an ambitious project of trying to implement ballot polling statewide. But they're mostly doing it with pilots and test RLAs at this point. And we also spoke with Judd Choate, Director of Elections out at the Colorado Secretary of State's office. As you know, Colorado has extensive experience in RLAs. So that's why we focus a lot of our attention in speaking to the officials out there in Colorado because we know their experience with RLAs. And the reality is that we don't really have to make a final choice on an RLA today. In fact, the state is well positioned to conduct any of the three methods, but that entirely depends on the contest chosen to be audited and the margins between the winner and the loser. The purpose of this meeting here is to determine what our policy direction is going to be for the 2020 presidential preference primary in March and in the general election in November. Such choices will allow us to plan for any necessary equipment purchases, software, staffing, facilities, logistics. This presentation is going to focus on three sections today. What our options are for RLAs and how they impact us as an agency, software that we would use, and regulations. Now, most of my presentation is going to be on that first one there, and I will speak a little bit about the software and any potential regulations. Now, I know on August 14th, John Marion did a good job of explaining the basic mechanics of these different types of audits, so I won't delve too much into that, but I want to remind everyone that what these three RLAs have in common is the roll of the 10-sided die 20 times beforehand in order to generate that random seed. So whether it be Ballot level comparison, whether it be ballot polling or batch level, they all require the 10-sided die being rolled 20 times. As you remember, Chairwoman Medeiros was the first person that rolled out the die in pilot to generate that 20-digit seed. The seed is entered into the appropriate software, which uses that seed to randomly select the ballots being selected for the audits. So in ballot comparison, to give you an explanation of how ballot comparison works and how it would impact us specifically at the agency, this is a more technical audit in which a random sample of voted ballots is manually interpreted by human beings. If you see Mark Linderman here start fidgeting at all, that's because I might be off base on something. So
He's doing great.
He is the expert here. The manual interpretation is checked against the machine interpretation for that exact corresponding ballot. Now, to do this, the ballot needs to be tagged with an identifying number so that we can find that exact ballot and compare it to the cast vote record for that exact ballot. This will tell us precisely how the scanner counted that same ballot, and we can compare it to how humans count that same ballot. Just to put it simply, if you look at a cast vote record, it basically looks like a table with rows, and each row indicates what the vote was for. Was a vote for candidate A, candidate B, and how the machine counted each contest. And when we do a ballot level comparison, we can actually look at row 1, and then we find that exact ballot in the stack that is in row 1, and compare that to how a human is interpreting that same ballot. So we can actually, in a ballot level comparison, you can do that on a ballot by ballot basis. However, there are two major hurdles that we have to overcome to conduct that type of audit. First, I'll start with the precinct ballots. Our DS200 scanners do not have the ability to imprint the identifying number on a ballot. So the identifying number is important because when you look at that row 1 in the cast vote record, it needs to have an identifying number in the row so we can go look for the ballot with that same identifying number. So we know that that ballot corresponds to row 1 in that table. Our DS200s don't have the ability to do that. They don't have the ability to imprint a number on the ballot to match it up with that table, the cast vote record. And to my knowledge, we're not alone in that aspect. There are no other vendors that have a piece of equipment, a machine yet that can introduce, or at least ES&S does, that can imprint. Now, ES&S does plan on implementing a feature similar to that in the next generation of DS200, but it's not currently available on the current DS200. Secondly, ES&S randomizes the software. It randomizes the cast vote record at the precinct. For example, the first ballot scanned of the day on election day won't necessarily be the first entry in that table because they want to randomize that for voter privacy. They don't want someone to go and look at the poll pads and say, hey, who's the first person that checked in that day? And then go look at the cast vote record and say, what was the first ballot read that day? Because there's a good chance you could figure out that that person that first checked in is probably the first person that voted, and you'd be able to tell how they voted. So they randomize it so the first person of the day might not be all the way down into row 455 on the cast vote record table. So that is why that randomization occurs. In my discussion with ES&S representatives, they have no intention of removing that privacy safeguard, and I think others will agree there is no general consensus that it can be removed while still protecting voters' privacy, and that's a big part of the ballot level comparison. Secondly, as you know, we have DS850 high-speed scanners. They don't have those restrictions. Our high-speed scanners, the 850s we have in our warehouse, they can imprint the number on the ballots, and they can, and they don't randomize the cast vote record. So everything stays in the exact same order from when it's fed through the DS850, and we can look at that table, the cast vote record, and see how every single ballot was counted in that order. And that's because we feed the ballots in, I don't want to say randomly, but they're not associated with the voter at that point. So there is no risk to the voter's identity or vote being discovered that way. So that's why the high-speed tabulators can do that. And this is why a state like Colorado can do that type of audit, because they have their elections are mostly by mail ballot. And they use only central high-speed scanners like our 850s. However, we would need to fundamentally change the way we tabulate mail ballots to a certain extent. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Now, you may be thinking, after I pointed out those two giant hurdles, then why is ballot comparison even on this list? And why was it recommended in the report? Well, there is a variant of ballot level comparison called a transitive audit. And a transitive audit means that all the ballots cast at the precinct are rescanned on our high-speed tabulators. So that means that every single ballot that was cast out there on a DS200 on election day would have to be put through the 850 after the election in order to be scanned and included on the cast vote record. So remember though, this is not simply a simple rescan of ballots. Let me outline what we would need to do if this were the case, if we were to implement a transitive ballot level comparison. First, immediately after the election, approximately 1,300 sealed metal ballot security cases would have to come here to the Board of Elections, either by a vendor hired by the Board of Elections or delivered by the Board of Canvassers soon after the election. All the ballots must be stored and staged in our warehouse so they can be scanned, categorized, and retrieved as part of this audit process. At our current facility at 50 Branch Avenue, we do not have enough room to stage this amount of ballots in our warehouse where we are today. According to the calculations in the report, rescanning all the ballots will take approximately 1,500 person-hours. We estimate that to be about 2 weeks of time to complete the rescan. And this includes operating a second shift of personnel in order to have that happen in those 2 weeks. The rescan could not commence until after the recounts are complete, which is generally about 14 days after the election. Now, rescanning them doesn't just mean putting them through the 850. During our pilot, we learned that we needed about 6 to 8 people around that scanner in order to handle all the steps in the process. Because remember, first you have to verify the seals on each metal case. Then you have to take all the ballots out and you have to orient them all the same way. So they're all facing up and they're all facing the same direction. Because when it gets imprinted, you want the imprint to be on the same corner of every single ballot. And we need to create stacks of 200 ballots each, and we do that with a scale. The reason why we chose 200 is because 200 is the easiest way to handle, and if the machine did get jammed, which it did, I don't want to say often, but frequent enough that Mark was a little perturbed by it, but it does jam consistently enough that 200 batches means you only have to back up 200 if you have a jam or anything. And we would also, once imprinted through the scanner, the ballots need to be passed to a staff member, who in the pilot was Steve Taylor, who would basically have a laptop in front of him, who would identify what the range was for those imprints, place them into the ballot manifest, which is a tracking method for all of the unique batches. He would assign it a folder number, a box number, and then the 200 ballots would be placed into that folder, which would be labeled with those numbers, and that folder would be placed into a box, which would be labeled in that box. And all that information would be contained in the ballot manifest. So for example, the first batch might read box number 1, folder number A, ballots number 0001 through 200. So we know exactly where to find those particular ballots. Until all of the ballots have been rescanned and categorized and stored. Like I say, I like to say it's like we're creating a library card catalog of instead of tracking books, we're actually tracking ballots. For those of you old enough to know the Dewey Decimal System, I might be dating myself right now. The younger generation, I don't think, knows the Dewey Decimal System. So finally, the actual audit is conducted. A random seed is generated, as I said, and that's used to randomly select the necessary number of ballots to conduct the audit and achieve the desired risk limit. So, for example, if we set a 10% risk limit, which is common, there would be a 90% chance that the outcome of the election is accurate if the RLA is successful. Some jurisdictions set a 5% risk limit, which would ensure 95% accuracy, but you have to pull more ballots. Colorado set a 9% risk limit because the Secretary of State there had the leeway to set the risk limit that he felt was appropriate. Basically, software tells us exactly which ballots to pull because they're all pulled randomly, and then we go into that vast categorized library of ballots in our warehouse and we find them. If the ballot manifest was done correctly, then we should know exactly where every single physical ballot is on the cast vote record. that is chosen among the 350 to 740,000 ballots that will be part of this audit. Because this type of audit is much more precise, it requires fewer than 100 ballots usually to be pulled from the category ballots to be part of the actual audit. So on actual audit day, the software will only choose between 30 to 100 ballots that actually have to be manually reviewed by the staff. But that would be after all that work has been done for the rescanning of all the equipment, of all the ballots. Now, once our teams pull the exact ballots, a two-person audit board or boards would use software to manually review each ballot and enter their interpretations into that software. So essentially, like you saw in the pilot, they take ballot number 1, it'd be up on the screen, and they'd say, candidate A, vote for candidate A. Another operator, like in the pilot, Steve was that person. He would basically be operating the software, and he would make a mark for candidate A in the software. Click next in the software, move on to the next ballot. And you do that until you're through 30, 40, 50 ballots, whatever it is. If enough of the human interpretations match the machine interpretation, then the audit will be complete after round 1. If not, round 2 will commence, and more ballots will be pulled and interpreted until the risk limit is met, or a full hand count will be required if enough discrepancies are found. Now, some of the drawbacks that we have here to this, and I have drawbacks for all 3 of them, and these are the drawbacks for the ballot level comparison. If any discrepancies are found in the rescan, such as in the imprinting, the scanning, the ballot manifest, the label and storage system, this is going to have an adverse effect on the audit, because the audit board may be interpreting the wrong ballot, meaning that if the audit software said pick ballot number 26,050, and you go into your bunch of ballots and you think you have ballot 26,050, you go and when the audit board is looking at that ballot, they're comparing it to what the machine read. But if that ballot was mistagged or is not the right ballot, it doesn't line up with what's on the CVR, then it's going to look like there's a discrepancy. So it might say I vote for candidate B on the ballot, but in the software, but in the cast vote record from the rescan, it's going to say candidate A had gotten the vote, and that can lead to problems. In fact, and it could lead to a full recount of all the ballots themselves. In fact, in Colorado in 2017, Secretary of State had one county scrap their ballot level comparison right in the middle of it because their ballot manifest had so many errors that was leading to more. They actually switched to a ballot polling method instead because the ballot manifest had so many errors. In 2018, the Colorado Secretary of State almost had a county do a full recount, hand recount, because they suspected the ballot manifest had some discrepancies. However, luckily the county was able to meet the risk limit and complete the audit after 4 rounds, and they avoided doing the hand count. So the ballot manifest and the logistics of doing that can be quite large, can be quite intense, even for larger counties, never mind on a statewide basis. Mail ballots, and I'm not going to go too much into this, Bob covered this, but in essence, right now, the way we process mail ballots, for the most part, is in that week before the election, depending on certifications and when voters mail their ballots in, we have different levels. The amount of mail ballots coming to the building can fluctuate. Now, we typically start processing them through our 850s about a week before the election, whenever we have enough ballots ready to be worth it to be scanned through, because the 850, as you know, operates very quickly. It only takes a 2 to 3 person team right now to operate each DS 850 in the current circumstances. And depending on how many ballots we get through certification, then the team will just assemble quickly and start running ballots, and we just separate them by city and town. However, if we're doing a ballot level comparison, it's not just a matter of getting 2 to 3 people together to run the DS 850. It's actually, you need to have this team of personnel there that are able to create this ballot manifest and this whole complex procedure of getting every ballot imprinted on the manifest and stored in the proper folder and labeled correctly. So that's not going to happen with just a 2 to 3 person team. So you'd have to have this team assembled or have the staff on hand to be able to assemble the team quickly in order to run ballots through, the mail ballots through the 850. If there's a delay in counting the mail ballots because of this, either because of staffing or they have to be scheduled so we can have the people here that know how to do it on hand, then that could delay the mail ballot tabulation if we get behind on tabulating mail ballots until election day, and they build up to the point that we're not ahead of them on election day. And because it will take 3 to 4 DS 850s on 2 shifts with a team of 6 to 8 people per scanner, we would lack enough permanent staff to be on all teams on both shifts. Therefore, we would need to rely heavily on temporary or seasonal staff, which could lead to problems with the ballot manifest, because as you know, as you can see here, creating the ballot manifest is complex, and the outcome of the audit depends heavily on the accuracy of the manifest. There are several people in this building that could probably handle that operation. We would have to train 6 to 8 more people at least that could run a team of 20 to 24 people that would be able to create that manifest even when we were not in the building, because it would have to operate on 2 shifts for about 2 weeks after the election. Now, according to ES&S, the purchase of 2 additional DS850s by 2020 is not possible because they're backordered. However, 2 may be rented to supplement our 2 that we have here in our warehouse at a cost of $50,600 per election. A smaller unit, the DS450, is available for purchase at $110,000 for both units. Or we could rent both units for about $30,600 per election for 2 units for the 850. However, the DS450 is rated at only 70 ballots per minute compared to the 850, which is 300 ballots per minute. So this may increase the length of time needed to complete the rescan if we were to go with the DS450s. And there would also be an additional cost if we wanted trained ES&S personnel to come in and operate those scanners. Now, alternatively, as I mentioned, we could train permanent staff to operate the machines, but that would make them unavailable for other important post-election responsibilities 2 to 3 weeks after the elections. Another option would be to train seasonal staff. Now, seasonal staff, hiring good seasonal staff can be arduous. The board only has 14 seasonal staff positions, with the rest being emergency appointments. Most of them can only be appointed for 30 calendar days. They can only work 30 calendar days. So as you would imagine, in 2020, with 3 statewide elections, the PPP, statewide primary, and the general election, we'd literally be running out, our emergency appointments would be running out of days to be able to be paid as we move into the busiest election of the year in November, which would not be a good situation to be in. Another drawback is approximately 80 to 90% of all our ballots are cast at the precincts. Since the DS850 is actually retabulating all of the precinct ballots for that ballot level comparison, then the DS200s are not directly being audited. And according to experts like Jennifer Morrell from the Democracy Fund, who we spoke to extensively, transitive audits do raise the questions of whether the system of record, such as the DS200s, are better audited using other methods. All ballots also must be brought to the Board of Elections, and this is also true for ballot polling as well. So we would have to make the space in our warehouse in order to house and stage all of these ballots in our warehouse, which we currently do not have enough room to do. And the number of ballots is significant and can vary with election type. It's important to note that every single page of every single ballot must be rescanned and imprinted. Therefore, the number of ballots cast statewide can vary greatly depending on the number of state and local questions put before voters, which can affect how many pages of the ballot there are. If you can see here on this chart, from 2000 to 2018, the number of ballots varies wildly. It can go as low as 387,000 in 2002 to a high of 739,000 ballots in 2006. And it varies generally by presidential to gubernatorial, but also, as I said, depending on how many state and local questions are, it can be even greater. So that means that in 2012, if we were running in 2006, if we were running a ballot level comparison audit, we would have to have 739,000 ballots come into our warehouse and have them rescanned. Oops. So, on to the next audit method, ballot polling. And these are less detailed since they're not, the audit types are not as complex as ballot level comparison. In ballot polling, a random sample of voting ballots is manually interpreted, and the resulting manual vote counts are checked against the total machine counts to see if they provide a strong statistical evidence that the reported outcome is correct. This method is very similar to exit polling, or like any poll. It depends on how good the sample is. Now, to conduct this audit, all the ballots have to be brought to the Board of Elections immediately after the election by a vendor that we hire, or we have to ask our local boards to bring them back. So that's similar to ballot level comparison. We would still need to have all the ballots brought back for this type of audit. After 2020, it's possible that we could eliminate having the ballots brought back here for a ballot polling audit, because we could actually have the local boards potentially do the audit at the local level. And using software that I'm going to cover in a few minutes, they would be able to enter the results of their audit into that software at the local level, and then we would focus on auditing the mail ballots. And that's not unlike what Colorado does, where the counties enter their audit results into software that is managed by the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary of State oversees the audit statewide, but they're done on a local level by the counties, and the results are entered into the software at the county level. A ballot manifest is still created for this ballot polling audit, but instead focuses more on the precinct number and the number of ballots cast in each precinct or in each scanner, which would be corroborated with other data like how many voters checked in on the poll pads or what the poll workers wrote on their election certificates. Our staff would still need to store and stage all the ballots in our warehouse so they could be retrieved from the audit. Simply put, it's like any other poll, so the accuracy depends on the quality of the sample. And to get a sample, we use that random seed. The software randomly selects the number of ballots to be pulled by our teams. For example, the software will say, retrieve ballot number 254, number 302, and number 987 from precinct 0724. So our teams would take that list, go to the cases or boxes for that particular precinct, and they have several ways to get that ballot. Because remember, the ballots aren't imprinted in a ballot polling. You're just literally trying to find ballot number 254 cast for the day, ballot 302, and ballot 987. And the way we did this in the pilot is we tried 4 different ways to do this. We preferred for larger precincts, using the counting method. Means we start at the top of the stack of ballots for that precinct and just count down to ballot number 254. And that's how we would figure we got ballot 254 from that particular precinct. For larger methods, we preferred the K-cut, which was a method developed by Ron Rivest from MIT. And basically, it's like it relies on randomly shuffling precinct ballots like a deck of cards, rather than looking for specific ballot numbers. And you basically just cut the stack different ways so you get an actual random ballot. And you're not looking for a specific ballot, you're just trying to get it randomly from that pile to meet the statistical math requirements. And we also use the weighing method, which uses high precision scales to basically get down to that particular number of ballot the software is asking for. So if it's asking for ballot number 254, you just put the whole stack on the ballot, stop peeling ballots off until it tells you that you have 254 ballots on there, and you pull the first one off the top. Once all those ballots are retrieved, they go before a 2-person audit board, who, again, they make the manual interpretations of the ballot on the screen in public. The software will then tabulate the manual entries and determine if the risk limit has been met for the first round. If not, additional ballots will need to be pulled for additional audit rounds until the risk limit is met or a full hand recount is conducted. The drawbacks for this is like ballot level comparison, we would need to stage and store all the ballots in our warehouse. We don't have enough room to do that at the moment. The number of ballots need to be pulled can be quite large. So it's directly dictated by the margin of victory for the winner. So a tighter race means way more ballots required for the ballot polling method. And as I said, the state of Michigan is currently moving on with ballot polling. They are even though they are a swing state, they are relying on ballot polling. Although if you have some discussions with Jenny from the Secretary of State's office, she gets nervous when we talk about closer margins.
Yeah.
These are more difficult to plan for, because if the contest margin is small and the audit is much larger then the audit could be much larger than you actually anticipated and planned for. And it's more difficult to determine the cause of any discrepancies. since the ballots are not directly tied to a specific entry in this cast vote record. You're just randomly polling ballots like you would do in any poll. And I know that on the November 14th meeting, John Marion had mentioned the 2016 sewer bond issue in North Kingstown, where we had an issue where it was not, the DS-200s did not tabulate that correctly. And that was tied to the ballot, how the ballot was designed or laid out. And the Secretary of State's office has implemented a new procedure at their end to prevent what happened in 2016 from happening again. And since that time, we have had no issues. So in 2018, we did have no issues with something similar in our 2018 statewide elections. So finally, the third method is the batch comparison method. Now in batch comparison, a random sample of batches is selected, and the votes in each batch are counted manually. A batch may consist of all the ballots cast in a precinct or in a particular voting machine. These counts are compared to the corresponding machine or precinct counts, batch by batch, to measure discrepancies, as in ballot polling or ballot level comparison. So this method looks a lot like a standard percentage audit. So for example, in Massachusetts, they may require 3% of precincts be tabulated, or in Connecticut it may be 10 or 15%. Whatever the number is, that's a flat percentage, but this doesn't rely on just a flat percentage. This relies on actually randomly selecting precincts in order to be audited, and using the statistical math to select the best precincts to do that with, to meet the risk limit. To conduct this particular audit, only the ballots that are part of the audit have to be transported to the Board of Elections. So out of 461 precincts, we might need to only request 31 precincts be brought here for that audit. And the number of precincts selected can vary based on the margin of victory in the contest. Based on historical data, a batch comparison of the presidential preference primary would probably entail looking at 20,000 to 25,000 ballots. For the presidential election in November, between 13 and 25,000 would be audited depending on the margin of victory. Now, once all these selected precincts have been delivered to the Board of Elections, either by the local board or if we go and pick them up, the board would assemble teams to hand count each precinct in full. So this is the biggest difference with the batch comparison. You're picking the entire precinct and you're counting all the ballots in that one precinct. So rather than going out into all 1,600 boxes that would be in our warehouse, we would just be simply asking for 10 to 30 precincts be delivered to us, and we would hand count all of the ballots in those precincts and enter them into the software. As seen in our January pilot, a team of 4 people would use a method called hash marking and tally sheets to actually count the ballots using hash marks. In the pilot, they actually had 2 people hash marking, so they actually had double verification. So they have one team hash marking, verifying the selections, let's say for governor. They would verify the vote for governor, and then another team was doing the same thing. So at the end, they would actually compare the results to make sure there was no human error in doing the tally. And if there was a discrepancy, they would do it again. When completed, those tally sheets are checked for discrepancies, as I said, and if discrepancies are found, they're redone. Once complete, the results are entered into software. Once all the selected precincts have been completed, the software will indicate if the risk limit has been met. If not, the second round will need to be completed. And for batch comparison, that would be scheduled for another day because we would need to get those ballots in from the local boards for the second round so we can get more precincts in to hand recount them. And again, if more errors are found, then more batches would have to be added until eventually you end up with a full hand recount. The drawbacks to the batch comparison. The number of precincts selected and therefore the number of ballots can increase significantly for contests that have a closer margin. More difficult to plan for if the contest is a lot closer and the audit becomes much larger than anticipated. Since more ballots are being interpreted by human beings, then the risk of human error increases. So, meaning the ballot says vote for candidate A, but this team actually writes down a vote for candidate B. You're going to think it's a discrepancy, but it's not. It was just human error. More difficult to determine the direct cause of any specific direct discrepancies because it's not tied to a specific CBR or the cast vote record table. If you look at the charts here, we went through and looked at the last 3 presidential elections, and we basically figured out how many ballots we would have to look at for all 3 type of audits. So we said if we had to run an audit in 2008, 2012, 2016, how many ballots would each audit entail? And you can see in 2016, if we were the most recent election, there were 124,000 ballots cast in the PPP. It was a 12% margin of victory for the winner. In a ballot level comparison, we would have to pull 49 ballots. In a ballot polling, we would need to pull 596 ballots. In both of those audits, we would have to have had all the ballots brought here to the Board of Elections that were cast at the precincts. And in the batch comparison, we would have had to only ask for 22 precincts be brought to us, and we would have manually tallied 21,300 ballots as part of the batch comparison in those 22 precincts. And in 2012, which is a much wider margin, which is more of an anomaly, because the Democratic primary didn't have a challenger, in 2012, we would look at the Republican race, and it was a 39% margin in that year for the winner, and only 24 in the ballot level comparison, 150 in ballot polling, and then 1,300 or 8 precincts in the batch comparison. And then finally in 2008, which was a very busy presidential year, it was an 18% margin. We would have to have pulled 30 for ballot comparison, 235 for ballot polling, and 23,900 for batch comparison. Now remember, when you look at ballot comparison, let's say for 2008, when you see 30, it looks like a low number, but remember, we have to rescan all 188,000 of those ballots in order to look at those 30. For the other 2 methods, we don't do that rescan. So the ballot level comparison requires a lot more upfront work. And if you look at the data for the general election, the last 3 presidential elections, you look at 2016, our most recent one, 417,000 ballots were cast. We would have to rescan all 417,000 ballots to do the ballot level comparison, but we would only end up pulling 48 ballots once we did the whole rescan of the 417,000. Ballot polling, we'd still have to bring all the ballots in here, but we would have to go out and pull 415 ballots. We would have had to have pulled 415 ballots from all those ballots in our warehouse. For batch comparison, we would have asked the local boards to deliver it to us, 17 precincts worth of ballots, and we would have done a hand recount of 20,000 ballots by hand. And again, 2012 was a very busy year for ballots cast. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were a lot of local questions on those races in 2012. A lot of state questions as well, so we had a lot of lengthy ballots, 2-3 pages. We would have to rescan all 729,000 ballots for the ballot level comparison, but we would only have to pull 41 after we did that rescan. 150 would have to be pulled for ballot polling, and again, 12,200 or 10 precincts would have to be for batch comparison. And then in 2008, 579,000 ballots cast. Those have to be rescanned in order to pull 32 ballots for the ballot comparison. For ballot polling, only 150 ballots would have to be pulled, but we still need the ballots all in our warehouse, and then 10 precincts for batch comparison. If you look at that same chart, that same numbers on a chart, you can see that, so that you know that I don't want you to think the data is misrepresented, but in terms of what we would have to handle in terms of ballot comparison, even though the number of ballots as part of the audit is much lower, so ballot level comparison is in the blue, that's how many ballots we would have to process, meaning rescan to do the ballot level comparison. So you can see the blue as compared to the yellow, which is almost non-visible in ballot polling, and batch, which is in the green, green there, when you compare the 3 methods for the last 3 presidential election cycles. Then I'm going to go through that in a second. So in the past week, well actually, you know, I'm going to finish going through this here. If you look at, I also had my staff run numbers based on what we handle in typical recounts. So you all here on the board have been through at least one set of recounts, and you understand the logistics that go behind handling recounts when we bring all those ballots from the local boards. And typically, we actually see, like in 2008, recounts in orange all the way to the right, we processed 40,000 ballots as part of the recounts in 2008, 32,000 in 2012, and 38,000 or 31,000 in 2016. That's not far off from what we would have to handle in a batch comparison. I understand that, with the recounts, we're feeding them to the DS200s. With the batch comparison, we're actually manually tallying them, so it will take more time, but it's not a significantly more time than it would take than conducting a batch comparison. So the batch comparison numbers that we handle relate closely to what we've handled in the past, to recounts, when we conduct our recounts, our 5 to 7 recounts every year, every 2 years. And again, if you look at, looking at the recount, number of recount ballots versus batch, you can see in 2008, side by side, with the orange being recounts and the blue being a potential batch comparison. If we had done a batch comparison in 2008, 12, and 16, you can see how the number of ballots involved in a batch comparison, what they look like compared to what we already handled already for recounts, with the recounts being orange. So it's very similar to what we handled in our recounts process. Now my last 2 slides here, before I just go over quickly into the software, into the regulations, is our calendar. So our calendar for looking ahead to 2020. If you look at Election Day is on November 3rd, Tuesday, November 3rd. And in future years, Election Day, as you know, can be as early as November 2nd in any particular year, or it can be as late as November 8th. So we're sort of towards the early end for 2020. That first week, the day after the election, November 4th through November 6th, we would actually be getting all our ballots. If we were to do a ballot level comparison or a ballot polling audit, we would be asking the boards of canvassers, we need all your ballots. So we would either hire a vendor to do that, or we would ask them to bring them to us. So in addition to bringing us back their returns from the election, bringing back any recount ballots, and anything else, and any equipment that would be coming in. Any equipment that would be coming into the warehouse is still coming back from the polls. We would also be asking for all the ballots cast at the precincts be delivered back to us that week between the 4th and the 6th. The deadline for recounts is on the 20th. The law states that we cannot conduct an RLA on any contest that's recounted, and we would be preparing for the recounts as a staff anyway, so we would not be conducting the RLA in all likelihood until after the recount deadline has passed and recounts have been conducted. So after the deadline is Veterans Day on the 11th, and then basically on the 12th and the 13th of November, we're preparing for recounts, and then we conduct the recounts on Monday and Tuesday, the 16th and the 17th. So on the 18th is when we would actually start the RLA process. So in the blue up there, you can see ballot polling or batch comparison. Those are the options number 2 and number 3. We would start those on November 18th, potentially, and we would finish them on November 24th, the 2 days before Thanksgiving. So we estimate it would take us about 5 days to complete the batch comparison or the ballot polling. And if you look at the red, the reddish pink line there, starts on the same day on the 18th. That's ballot comparison. That's the ballot level comparison audit. That means we're starting to rescan all of the ballots at that point. Starts on the 18th, and it will go through the next week after that, because it is approximately 10 days, through the rest of November, and then into December, the first week of December, the ballot level comparison still continues with the rescanning, with the actual audit of the ballots, meaning actually pulling the ballots and reviewing them, conducted on the 4th and the 7th of December. We would finish the ballot level comparison audit by December 7th, compared to November 24th for the other 2 options. Now the ballot level comparison, that would finish on the 7th, assuming that everything goes well. So assuming that all of the rescans happen correct, the ballot manifest is done correctly on the 2 shifts that would be needed to run it. That is assuming there are no errors in the ballot manifest and in the imprinting of the ballots. If not, that yellow set of days you see there, the December 8th through the 11th, that represents a window of what we could push into, because on the 14th of December, we actually have to have the results certified for the meeting for the presidential electors at the State House that go to the Electoral College. So we would have to complete the audit by the 14th, so those can be ready for that event at the State House. So any errors that happen could slow it down and push into that yellow, but that's the only window that we have there at that point in order to finish the audit, if it was a ballot level comparison. So in the past week, we posed this simple question to this group of experts and officials that we contacted. Were they aware of any other jurisdiction with similar equipment to Rhode Island, with most of their ballots being cast in the precincts that were considered using a ballot level comparison transitive audit? And the uniform answer amongst all of them was no, they were not. Most jurisdictions considering RLAs were focused on using ballot polling or batch comparison, because rescanning all the ballots in the transitive audit made the RLA very inefficient, which seemed to defeat the purpose of the original intent of the RLA, and the benefits of conducting ballot level comparison did not justify the amount of time and effort to rescan all of the ballots. And this is just me paraphrasing based on our discussion with this group of individuals over the last week and a half. The consensus was that most jurisdictions with similar systems were only considering ballot polling or batch level comparison as viable options for them with similar systems to us. Now finally, I have a few quick things to talk about the software. The staff agrees with the report that the RLO software being produced by Voting Works presents the best software solution for the Board of Elections. The cost to utilize and have Voting Works host the RLO software, which is software that would be used for RLAs in the future, if selected, would be less than $20,000. There is no cost to use the software in 2019. In fact, we've had numerous discussions with Monica Childers at Voting Works about possibly conducting a small pilot later this year on one of our upcoming special elections that we have in October and November. She's expressed interest in assisting us with that, and also said she would be on site for any such pilot as well to assist us. The RLO software currently supports ballot polling. It will support ballot level comparison soon, and Voting Works expects it to support batch comparison by April of 2020. That's especially true of Rhode Island. She said, this is her words, that is especially true of Rhode Island, being just the second state to do statewide RLAs, chooses batch comparison as a preferred method to audit the presidential primary or the general election. Now, RLO also supports remote site auditing, and just for some background, RLO basically came out of the Colorado software. So the Colorado software was open source. That was part of the requirements that Colorado had when it was developed. So they basically made it open source, and this is a variant of that original Colorado software, so that the rest of the country can utilize it in their RLA. So RLOs basically came out of what came out of Colorado for the rest of the country to use. And Voting Works is in fact maintaining and supporting the RLO software. So the remote auditing would help in future audits, because essentially, as I said earlier, if in the future after 2020 we wanted to move some of this auditing to the local level, we could have the local boards of canvassers conduct the audit at that level, and they could enter the results into the RLO software. From there we could monitor it, and we would audit the actual mail ballots. For 2020, however, the staff feels that keeping the audits conducted centrally is important because of the newness of this process to the state. Regardless, the Board of Elections plans to engage our local boards of canvassers to assist us in conducting these RLAs, just as we did in the pilot. For now, centralized audits can also serve to educate local canvassing officials on RLAs, how they're conducted, which is vital because, of course, local boards will be increasingly more involved in the RLA process in the future. So, regulations, final topic for me, is the staff has already begun the preliminary process of creating 2 rules and regulations that will help govern RLAs here in the state. We've also worked with Common Cause, the Brennan Center, to create some general outlines of what regulations might and should contain, based on regulations in other counties and states that have implemented RLAs. There are 2 aspects of the regulations that need to be hashed out. The RLA protocols, meaning that how the RLAs will be conducted. The staff feels that any regulation should allow the board the flexibility to set the parameters of the RLA on an election-by-election basis, This includes choosing the method, setting the risk limit, determining which contests will be audited, and the number of contests to be audited, including whether they're federal, state, or local. RLAs are still a relatively new concept, and are new to us, definitely. In our recent discussion with Monica of Voting Works and Jennifer Morrell of the Democracy Fund, where they both submitted emails to us with their thoughts on the choice of method, when possible, we should state regulations should give us flexibility and give us options, especially initially. When possible, we should initially focus on contests within specific margins and use those factors to determine the workload and efficiency of the audit. For the first few election cycles, we will still be learning what works and what doesn't, what is more efficient, what isn't. We'll need the flexibility to select parameters for the RLA that fit the conditions as they exist for any particular election, so we can effectively balance efficiency in the administration of the election with the important goal of confirming the integrity of the voting system. The second set of regulations are just as important, not just for RLAs, but other aspects of administration. That is the voter intent guidelines. Voter intent guidelines can be used in mail ballots, processing mail ballots, for remade ballots, recounts. All mail ballot states such as Colorado and Washington State have established robust voter intent guidelines, and we should use their guidelines as a basis to build upon and tailor to our own voting system. Because the RLA statute requires these particular regulations adhere to the Administrative Procedures Act, the time required to enact them is quite lengthy and will need to begin within the next 30 to 45 days at the latest if they are to be in place for the first RLA, which will happen in early May, after the presidential preference primary. The staff is going to work over the next few weeks to devise these regulations in coordination with our board legal counsel, Ray, and while also receiving valuable input from RLA experts and advocacy groups. Now finally, before I hand it back to Bob, I just wanted to mention a couple of unexplored alternatives that are not part of the report or anything like that, but we figured we just wanted to inform the board of what those are that are out there. Now, there are such things as digital RLAs. There are vendors out there that have built systems that utilize the digital scan. So as you know, our DS200 has the feature where it scans every ballot as it's counted on election day, and it creates an encrypted PDF of each file and stores it on its USB drive. There are companies that have software that actually can utilize these images. Under this type of RLA, no ballots would be brought in from the cities or towns to the Board of Elections, and all physical ballots would remain in their cases unless serious discrepancies are found in the audit. I know Maryland did a pilot using the images several years ago, is something similar to this. Ballot images would be used in the two-person audit team to conduct their interpretations into the software until the risk limit is met. However, most RLA experts do not consider these to be true RLAs because the actual paper ballots are not being examined. You're relying on the physical, the digital PDF scan that is out there. But there are companies now that are establishing a way to do this digitally. There is another option, a company called Clear Ballot, a vendor. They use a proprietary software to tabulate the ballots of most voting systems themselves, and they can use this with digital scans of the ballots. So essentially, they've created software that can count ES&S's ballots. So they can essentially recount the ballots and determine if ES&S's software was accurate in counting the particular ballots. They can do this either by using the digital scans that are created by the DS200 on election day, or they can actually, they have high-speed scanners that can re-scan all the ballots as well. And while it's not an RLA, it can also help identify potential ballot layout problems, like what happened in North Kingstown, or simply ballot layout issues that are causing voters to make more errors than common on their ballots that could be addressed and could be useful information. Thank you for your patience in listening to this lengthy description of these three methods, the software, the regulations, and how they will impact our elections process. I'm going to hand it over to Bob, who is going to give us our recommendation, and then after you, we're going to have Mr. Lutz discuss some other options as well.
Thank you, Miguel. That was a very thorough presentation.
A lot of hard work.
A lot of hard work went into that. Staff's been very busy. In closing, we think it's important to say that the reality is we don't need to lock ourselves into one specific method over another. But because ballot level comparison on a statewide contest, such as president or the governor, would entail capital investment in equipment and other infrastructure, policy decision must be made now to plan for those purchases and investments or invest our limited resources elsewhere. For this reason, it's the staff's position that the Board of Elections should move forward with planning on conducting a batch comparison audit of the 2020 presidential preference primary and the 2020 general election. If feasible, the staff also recommends conducting a ballot polling audit or ballot level comparison transitive audit on at least one city or town-wide local contest. The primary reasons behind this decision includes historically, margins in presidential preference primaries and presidential contests have been such that the number of ballots involved in a batch comparison audit are manageable and in line with the number of ballots the board is accustomed to handling in recounts. Ultimately, you, the board, will choose the contest to be audited. As in Colorado, particularly for the first few election cycles, audited contests should be chosen based on their estimated workload for the state and local boards, as well as any other benefits selecting particular contests could have using opportunistic voting. For batch comparison, on a contest on the ballot statewide, only the selected batches need to be brought to the BOE, meaning only 10 to 30% of our ballots cast at the 461 precincts need to be stored and staged in the BOE warehouse. For ballot polling or ballot level comparison, audit on a citywide or townwide contest, only the ballots for that city or town need to be delivered to the BOE. In the case of ballot level comparison, only those ballots need to be rescanned and reprinted. Both audits would closely resemble the workload in our January pilot, and our existing two DS-850s can handle the volume with normal seasonal staff levels. We will be auditing the actual system of record, the DS-200s, rather than a ballot level comparison audit, which audits the DS-850s on which only 10 to 15% of the ballots are counted in the state. Batch comparison auditing feels similar to the recount process that we currently conduct, which is much easier for the public to comprehend in a process with which the staff is already familiar. This will make it easier to explain the audit results to candidates and voters, as well as follow familiar staffing patterns the BOE is already accustomed to form past elections. Ultimately, the decision is yours, and we as the staff are ready and capable of implementing any policy choice you direct. However, in our opinion, based on our extensive experience as a staff conducting statewide elections in our state, we feel the batch comparison method on statewide contests strikes the right balance of efficiency of the administration of the entire election process, as well as verifying the integrity and accuracy of our voting system. And that concludes the staff presentation of risk limiting audits. If you have any questions.
Question, Dave. I know we're going to talk about the budget.
We actually have one.
Yeah, but the question is, how much are we going to be budgeting for each of these methods?
Well, we actually have HAVA money. We have $400,000 of HAVA money that we can use for the 2020 and the 2022 elections. But the ballot level comparison has a very high cost of the fact that there's a lot of prep time, and we would have to hire staff, where we wouldn't so much with the other methods. The ballot level comparison concerns me based on the fact that we would be here scanning ballots for days on end to relatively pull a very small number of ballots. Batch comparison, we can recruit the assistance of the local boards. We're not pulling many ballots, as Miguel explained. We may pull 20, 25,000 ballots, but we're touching them one time. They would be brought up here by the local boards. We would do the seed, we would pull the ballots, we would do the audit, repackage them, they go back to the cities and towns. So we do have money, to answer your question, we do have funding for 2020 and 2022. After that, the funding will have to go into our annual budget.
So how much do you figure that will be?
It depends on how risk limiting audits evolve in the country as time goes on.
How much of the cost would go to the cities and towns?
Well, none. We'd be borne by the state.
It would.
That's all, even when, if you decide to send it down to the cities and towns to do it, the state will pay for it?
We would then have to, if we did that in 2020 and 2022, the HAVA money could be recalculated to go to the cities and towns. We wouldn't have that much flexibility if it was in our state budget.
And then after that, would it be on the cities and towns to put it into their budget?
They would, if we were going to proceed on that path, at some point, the cities and towns would have to fund what they did in their budgets.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. And thank you for everybody who took part in this. And,
Yeah, very well.
appreciate it.
So we have one other speaker on this, is Ray Lutz. I'll let him introduce himself. He's from the Citizens Oversight Project. He traveled out here from California specifically for this meeting, and he wanted to give you some information on, related to the batch comparison method as well. That's a specific method, and how it relates to, as far as he feels, it being the best option for Rhode Island as well.
Thank you very much, and as I said, I am from California, San Diego, and I have to say I'm quite jealous about the representation here in Rhode Island and your beautiful state. In the large state of California, we don't get the luxury of having such good representation, I have to say. Now, I came in, first of all, about myself. I have a master's degree in electronics and computer engineering. A lot of standard development process in the form of facsimile. I did actually international standards in facsimile back when that was a popular thing. And I've been involved in the last about 10 years in providing oversight to audits. In California, they do batch comparison audits. They use 1% of all the precincts and of the batches. It's a fixed percentage. And Citizens Oversight is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So I joined the various groups that were communicating about this project for about the last year or so. And unlike other groups that I've been in, they have a bias against ballot image audits, which they just never discussed. My suggestion to include that in the study was not embraced. Yet other districts such as Maryland included that in their study. So it's an option that I think should be considered. Since the conclusion of the study to use ballot comparison audit was already decided, we agreed on the phone that I should come and present my dissenting opinion. No disrespect to anyone. I think this is a fantastic report that they generated, and all the work done was a a lot of work, a lot of volunteer time and effort. I don't want to undercut the work, nor, and I think they did improve the timing. I suggested they do a little better timing, and they did that. Election audits are of this type are relatively new, and so we should expect some disagreements about the best way to go. And so, of course, you should be aware. Now, I'm going to preview this. We're going to get to it at the end. But I'm just going to say I support the batch comparison audit, and I would like you to consider using the ballot image audit for local races. So we'll get to the details in a minute. I don't want to go through each thing up front, but those are the, and that is in concert with what I just heard today that you're already suggesting for the first component. Now, given my background in testing of electronics and other things, there's two main guidelines: divide and conquer, and test early and test often. Those sound simple, but they're really important when you try to get something done right and to a high quality. So those testing strategies are not really audits. They're what should be done in the elections process anyway. And so they should test a lot all the way through the process to make sure they're getting a good result. Don't rely on just the audit to make sure you're getting a good result. Now, risk is something you hear a lot here, risk limiting audits. The term risk, though, has been used primarily in this thing called probability risk assessment by scientists and engineers for a number of decades, especially in nuclear reactors and NASA space flights and so forth. Risk is a probability that something bad will happen times the consequences of that happening, usually the cost. If something has no cost, it doesn't matter even if it might happen. If usually, unfortunately, in nuclear reactors, they say, well, that has a very rare consequence, but very rare probability, small, but the consequences are huge, and you multiply them together and you still don't know what it is because they're both estimates and they come back down. So my observation is that the RLA advocates provide an incomplete analysis of the risk, because when they talk about the risk limit, they're actually talking about the sampling error and whether the sampling error is within a certain amount. But as you saw here, these can be very complex processes in themselves. So you're adding a lot of risk just in the process itself. Those were not ever really considered. I did do a paper which I sent you called Comprehensive Risk Estimation, where I took all of the factors I could think of. And I'm going to be doing more of that soon. The key election audit hazard I want to talk about. Election officials are auditing themselves. So right off the bat, you have a bit of a problem. No one in the financial auditing world would ever allow this. You have to have someone independent doing the audit. However, this is the way it's done. Now, the problem is that election workers want to have a clean audit. That's natural. They are used to correcting problems throughout the day, every single day, every hour of the day, correct the problems. But during the audit, you're not allowed to fix the problems. And if you fix them, then you're defeating the audit. So time again, when we're watching audits being done, not even this sophisticated audits, just the basic batch comparison audits, they tend to want to fix that batch. Get it to match. Well, maybe the scanner scanned them wrong. Run the batch back through, get a new report. You fixed it, but that doesn't mean that all the other batches are fixed. It just means you've identified the problem. This is what's done in Los Angeles over and over, and nobody really realized that they were defeating the audit. Audits should be simple, or mistakes and innocent fix-up can defeat them. If you have a really complex process in your audit, it's going to be really hard to do, for one, and you're going to get this need to try to fix it up. It's going to happen. Statistical RLAs, which were considered in this process, we've already heard that the process of doing the audit is very complex. It's difficult to perform. It's really hard to observe. and it's hard for the public to understand what's going on in general. As Colorado had to admit, it pushes humans to the extent of their ability to keep track of paper. There's all this paper you have to consider. It's very hard to keep track of it all. And the innocent picks up hazard every turn. So risk is actually not only the error rate of sampling, and is all these other risks that are included. And the other one is that close contests, when the margin gets close, then they quickly expand to a full hand count. And let me point that out with these charts. So the ballot comparison audit, which is the most efficient in terms of collecting ballots, once you get down to about a 2% margin, the number starts to shoot up through the roof. And the closer you get to zero, the higher and higher that'll get. I won't go into the difference in those, but just look at the blue line, which is the initial sample by Philip Stark, which they were using in their thing. Now, in the ballot polling audit, I differ a little bit with the numbers that were presented because those were very optimistic numbers. When you get down to below around 10%, you can argue about where the knee is there, but certainly by 5%, it starts to shoot up. And that means you're going to be doing 5, 10, 20, 25,000 ballots individually polled and sampled. Continuing with some of these weaknesses, one of the problems, since I'm an advocate for the public, I want to have as much auditing as possible, including all the lower races. I don't think those should be left out. I think all the races should be included in some kind of review. Typical implementation of these RLAs doesn't include any of those other races. They say they may optimistically or opportunistically add them. But the coverage of local contests becomes unwieldy because each local contest, you can imagine each, say, mayor's race, all the mayor's races are non-overlapping. You have to have a separate sample for each one of those mayor races. And if it's a close margin, that sample is, according to that curve that I just showed you, in each and every one. It isn't just one race. It's all of the races have to be sampled individually in those separate non-overlapping areas. The RLA procedures and publications don't help election officials choose the contest to be audited. Which one should you choose? They say, well, we'll just make it our choice. Well, that's not a bad good idea if they're auditing themselves. What if they're corrupt? Then they would just obviously not choose the ones that they fixed, and no one would be the wiser. If any set of contests are not all audited, if you say, well, we're just going to audit all the congressional races and the governor's race and all the statewide races, then fine, that'll work. But if you say we're going to audit just to our selection one of these countywide races, those should be randomly selected. What is the consequence? Close contests are high consequence. The power of the seat, a presidential race, I figure is about 2,000 times more consequential than a House seat. And a House seat, the average spend is about $1.3 million nationwide. So anything more than $1 million spend on a contest should be probably audited. Now, what is a ballot image audit? These were mentioned by Miguel earlier, and you call them digital audits. A ballot image is a high-resolution image of the ballot. We want a hand-marked paper ballot is the best way we know that the voter verified what they were voting because they had to write it in. A ballot image is no longer referred to the memory image of a DRE machine, which they used to use the same terminology. So we're not talking about a DRE machine ballot image. We're talking about an actual picture of the physical ballot. And most modern equipment produces these images right now. All the DS200s, all the equipment that we heard about today, but also the new equipment that we just reviewed from Clear Ballot, from HART, from ES&S, they all produce these high-resolution images. Clear Ballot even produces theirs in a grayscale type, which is even better. So a ballot image audit exhaustively recomputes the entire election from the ballot images, looking at every single one again. These can actually go further by actually validating not just where that little bubble is that's been darkened in, but also looking at what was the name next to it to make sure that XY coordinates that we thought we had correspond with that name. So they can go further than just using that pre-calculated XY coordinates. These are also compatible with crowdsourced audits. We saw this up in Minnesota with the Al Franken recount, where it was on the internet and they watched every single ballot be reviewed. Very nice and satisfying to the public. If ballot images are validated, which means compared with the paper, then it is a risk limiting audit. And I claim it has lower overall risk than any of these other methods. Why? Because you don't have all the human error and this hazard of innocent fix-up. I claim that with validation, that is, we look at a sample of physical ballots, compare them to the result, that it does comply with the risk limiting audit law that you have in Rhode Island. It can cover all contests, even down to the lowest school board race. You can look at them all and verify that voter intent, you can look at that ballot and see, was it check marked, was it not? Look at that image and see. If you want to do that by hand with all these paper ballots in a warehouse, it's very, very difficult to find those ballots and then look at them. Because you're looking at every ballot to begin with, it doesn't explode into a costly hand count. You're already doing them all. It can detect, even without doing the image validation, all the voter intent issues that are normally present in elections today. Nearly all the election processing errors that humans can make in the election processing. Nearly, but there's always mistakes that can be made. And nearly all malicious attacks, like if someone went in and just changed that cast vote record, moving thousands of votes from one candidate to another, this would catch it because the ballot images would have to be modified as well for it to be covered up. When election officials use this, they find it's very satisfying. I encourage you to talk to Maryland about their experience with this, because it gives them the satisfaction that, yeah, we can certify all these races are correct because we've looked at them all. Now we have third-party audit services that are going to be coming more available. I know Clear Audit does a service like this, but I think there's going to be many more in the near future. In fact, I know there will be. And it's compatible with this next generation voting equipment. But I have to say, as was mentioned, this scrambling of the images is something that doesn't affect this ballot image audit. The validation, I want to re-emphasize, is a review of the paper ballots. This wasn't mentioned by Miguel, but it's something that you would want to do. If you do a limited statistical RLA, which you're already proposing on maybe one race, one of those consequential presidential races, you're going to do that one. You're going to be comparing to the paper, and those consequential races is where those malicious attacks might occur. So with that limited RLA, you can validate those images so that they can be used for all the rest of the races. Now I know I'm taking a while, so I want to go on. There is this one type of malicious ballot image audit attack, but with the limited RLA, it does cover that. And again, my recommendation, I'll be a little more detailed this time. The batch comparison audit, I support that recommendation. I suggest that you increase your thinking on it, however, to cover any contest with spending of over $1 million. Those are the ones that are going to be possibly maliciously attacked. A school board race and one county somewhere, I don't think anybody's going to spend the time and effort to maliciously attack a race like that, so I don't think you need to worry about those. But anything over $1 million, we start to talk about real consequence. With this, of course, as mentioned, the batch comparison, you don't need to rescan the ballots, and the logistics is so much easier. The traditional canvass report, that's the important thing I want to emphasize that's important about the ballot batch comparison audit. This traditional canvass report that breaks it down batch by batch, precinct by precinct is good enough. However, it has to be published in advance before you do that random selection so that it's pinned down. My example to that is if you're on the playground and two kids find a piece of candy and one puts it behind his back and says, pick which hand is it in. Now, you've got to have the hands out. You can't put them back here or else they're going to switch the candy. You'll never get that piece of candy. So that's like publishing those reports. Those have to be done in advance. I suggest you batch sample using the most significant close contest as deciding the number. And assume the max error rate per batch is 40% and use a weight and random sampling. I can go into this more later. It will result in fewer batches required than was shown here today. That is an overly conservative number that was suggested. The number of batches doesn't need to be quite that high. This process of doing that batch comparison also validates the ballot images in the process. Then, also I should say, to support batch comparison audit, you should try to reduce your precinct size and make them more uniform. I've heard that some other precincts the batches are pretty large. They should be brought down to maybe an average of around 500 to 1,000 at the most, and more uniform as possible. Then, after you've done the batch comparison audit, you can use the ballot image audit to check on all of the local races and all the other races that are not those most consequential. The ballot images should be secured after they're created as soon as possible, posted on a secure website, at least the hash codes, so that they can't be modified. This is something most people don't realize, is that once you secured those ballot images, they can't be changed without detection. So as soon as the ballot images come in from the field, they should be locked down and the hash codes published. And that is, and then what I've seen done with ballot images, for example, Dane County in Wisconsin publishes all their ballot images. You can go up there and get them all. And that's a great measure of transparency that hopefully we can get to. If you publish all your ballot images, and anybody, a group like ours, will go in and we'll retabulate them all and check on your result. Or you can pay somebody to do it, a trusted service. And it's going to be, let me just say one other thing before I conclude. There's a few steps that Miguel mentioned that we don't agree with at Citizens Oversight. In other words, we don't agree that you should be entering the numbers directly into the software. Those should be always entered onto a paper sheet so that we can see those later and people can sign the result before they're entered into the software. Batch comparison audits are very much superior because you've got the tally sheet. It reduces the amount of entry by maybe 20 times. So you enter the totals of the batch sheet into the software, but those sheets we can look at later and see what those totals were, and therefore eliminate that risk that we see in possibly somebody hacking the audit software instead of just the voting machines. Okay, that concludes my remarks. I'd like you to again, take this into account. I know everything is new, but hopefully this will help your decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I should have a question. What states use this ballot imaging?
Well, Maryland, there's a few counties in Florida that are using it. And there was one, I think it was Ohio, or no, it was Vermont. Some areas in Vermont are using it, some places in Florida, and I know Maryland did the whole study. They studied ballot image audits with their other ones, but I will say that I don't fully agree with what Maryland did because I do think that you should go back and somehow look at some paper to verify that the images were okay. at least in those high consequence races.
Any other questions? John, did you have a question?
Can I just say very briefly, 3 brief points? Thank you, and thank you, Bob, obviously, for the kind words, and Miguel and Steve and everyone for all the work. I just want to make 3 points that I kind of feel like I can't sit there and not make. And thank you, Ray, for coming out from California. And this is the first time we've ever actually met in person. He accused the group of bias against this method. I was, as it's been stated ad nauseum, on almost every one of these calls. It was not proposed prior to the planning of the January audits that we do this. So I take some offense, I feel like I'm in Hamilton here, at the accusation of bias. Okay, there was no bias from my perspective, and I try to be very open to all forms of bias. The second thing is, I don't believe his representation that the law allows this type of audit is an accurate representation of the law. I believe the law requires the hand examination of the paper. We could dispute that, but that's just my interpretation of that law. And then, honestly, we're fine with this. Bob and I were here when Clear Ballot came through with their show about this. They have a really excellent product. I don't believe it's an RLA, their product. I think it tells us something about how voters mark ballots, how the voting system performed, that is valuable for election administrators, but I don't believe it's an RLA. So we're not against using images. We just don't think images meet what we consider to be a risk limiting audit. I did not come up here to start a kind of Tiverton back and forth by any means, but I just kind of felt I needed to say those 3 things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I'd like to say one more thing, and that is that I do think that maybe not individually, but in these comments that I just heard, this is not an RLA. I think that's actually incorrect. This is a type of risk limiting audit. It is not the type that was originally proposed by those that created the papers. But even on the phone call earlier this week, they're creating a chart that has various options, and the ballot image audit is not included as an option. It is a valid option. It is something that states can use, jurisdictions can decide to use, and there's nothing religious about the term RLA that you should be devoting yourself to. Just because the term wasn't part of those 3 that first came out on those papers, I still would assert that it is a viable, does limit the risk much better than these other things. And indeed, the reason I'm here is because they did not embrace my comments on these calls, and I had to make this trip to make sure that this got out. And it's my professional responsibility, I felt, as an engineer and as a professional, to make sure that this information was provided to the decision makers, and so that's why I'm here. If they completely covered it and said, we've analyzed this, it was part of our analysis, then they would have included it. But there was a bias against this, and they did not include it in their original thinking, so that's why I'm here. And so that's my answer to that. Thank you.
You have a question on that?
Yeah, I want to go back to what Bob said in regards to the $400,000 we have in the base, and that we will use that $400,000 for the next audit, and then we're going to send it down to the local communities.
If you decide that the local boards are going to be conducting the risk limiting audit in the future, the funding that we currently have will run out. Because the $400,000 that we have is federal HAVA money, Help America Vote Act money,
Yeah.
which can be transferred down to the local level.
Yeah. Okay.
But after that runs out, the state would not be transferring money to the local level.
Correct. And I'll tell you what, me personally, any more taxes laying on the local communities, I am not for it. And I'll tell you right now, because I think when we start to do this, and then we use some kind of means to get them, to get it to the local communities, for each local communities to raise their taxes, I'm not for it. We gotta find another way to fund it. I'm not saying this isn't a good thing, because I believe in auditing, but I don't think the local taxpayers should be the ones to fund this program.
And we actually have 4 years. I mean, we don't really need to worry about that until 2024.
Well, I'm
And
worrying
by
right now, because when it comes up, I don't want anybody to say, oh, it's a done deal, or it's over, and it's done. No, I'm saying it right now up in front, that I would not vote for it.
You may decide that when the harbor money runs out, that we conduct all the audits here similar to the recounts. We conduct recounts. The local level does not do recounts, the state does. And the audits may be done in the same fashion. Hopefully we will be in a larger facility and we'll be able to do this more.
Accommodate.
Absolutely, I agree.
Are there other questions?
Bob, yeah, I just want to clarify, just because it was a bit ago now, the staff's recommendation is to do the batch level RLA statewide, and then for each of the other options, pick a city and sort of do a run of one of the ballot level polling and one of the ballot polling and one of the ballot level comparison. Is that what
That's
you're
correct. I
asking?
would, for state, after the PPP and the 2020 general election, recommendation is that we do a batch comparison for those two. Because we can always go into the other methods at a later time.
Okay.
And because risk limiting audits are in its infancy, there may be new methods that come out that are better, more effective, and more efficient that you may decide to use.
But what we need now is to determine how we're going to do this for the presidential elections.
My recommendation would be that you select the batch comparison method.
Is there a motion?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Moved and seconded.
Yeah.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So ordered.
Number 5.
Number 5, the board will conduct the final canvass for City of Providence special election for Ward 10 council.